great halls of the medieval period were magnificent spectacles, gilded cages filled with wealth and ambition. They were places built for feast, for celebration, and most often for spectacular pettiness. It was not always high treason that precipitated a death in these echoing castles. Sometimes it was nothing more dramatic than who managed to secure the last portion of venison, or whose elaborate doublet drew the eye of a passing countess. Life at court was a constant, tense performance, a delicate ecosystem where status and survival were measured with the fork. This deep-seated paranoia bred a unique set of deadly hobbies, making toxicology less of a specialized art and more of an unfortunately common parlor game among the nobility, the ambitious merchant, and even the desperately envious retainer. When you lived in such close proximity to power, every glance held weight. Every whispered conversation carried the potential for ruin. The great feuds recorded by history books are often written in the broad strokes of battle or political assassination. But the true casualties were sometimes taken down with a single, slow dose, a venomous sprinkle into a seemingly innocent dish. These feuds weren't about reshaping kingdoms. They were about restoring cosmic balance to one's personal dinner plate. The desire for revenge was rarely grand in scope, but intensely focused and deeply intimate. Consider the atmosphere of a high feast. The table groaned under the weight of imported spices, roasted game, and endless bottles of costly wine. Beneath the joyous din of flutes and lute music, however, there existed a silence, the silent tallying of perceived slights. A slight regarding land rights was bad enough, a mere jab at one's lineage, or worse, being overlooked for favor by a rival patron, could curdle an entire lifetime of security into bitter resentment. The festering resentment required an outlet, and when reputation was everything, life itself became the currency you were willing to waste. The initial whispers of malice are always subtle. A slightly too long gaze across the crowded hall, an overly effusive compliment directed at a rival spouse, a bread crumb accidentally dropped near someone else's untouched plate. These trivial moments could become monumental psychological wounds. And when social wounding proved inadequate, desperate desperation led to the consideration of chemical countermeasures. The body became a highly complex, edible target. Poisoning, in this context, was not necessarily about instant malice. It was often about slow degradation, making the rival appear ill, unstable, or merely unlucky, the perfect veneer for slander. The medieval mindset was defined by a fatalistic grasp of social order. If life was arbitrary, dictated by fickle favor and the whims of divine blessing, then perhaps the ending needed to be equally subtle. The goal wasn't always death. Sometimes it was mere incapacitation, a deep sickness that would force a man out of public view, ruin his appearance for the crucial political gathering, or simply make him unable to taste life's great pleasures once again. demanded subtlety, a touch of poisonous elegance. The culinary landscape provided the perfect canvas for such deadly amateurism. Everything was prepared and consumed in close quarters. Spiced stews simmered over open flames, delicate confections dusted with expensive sugar, wine that could be spiked by a discreet hand passing through the throng. To poison effectively meant becoming an expert in both chemistry and charcuterie. The recipe required not just knowledge of toxins, but intimate knowledge of your target's digestion, their preferred meal pairings, and the exact moment when maximum lethargy would set in without raising immediate suspicion. The desperation that underpinned these attempts is crucial to understanding the era's toxic folklore. These people were often deeply intelligent, highly cultured individuals, scribes, court physicians, ambitious nobles who consumed books on herbology and chemistry alongside poetry. They understood enough about botany and rudimentary metallurgy to know which substances carried devastating potential. Arsenic, for instance, was readily available, simple enough to purify and mix into a sweetener, giving the illusion of a mere dietary indulgence rather than a death sentence. Nightshade berries, gathered by keen-eyed hands, offered neurological disruption without the immediate spectacle of blunt force trauma. These were not esoteric scientific acts. They were often kitchen chemistry experiments conducted in the desperate aftermath of an empty Boar rib plate. Once the petty jealousies were established, the stage was set for something far more insidious than a spilled goblet of wine. The medieval mind, under sustained duress and endless feast day paranoia, turned itself into an amateur laboratory. Poisoning became less a dark pursuit reserved for movie villains and more a niche hobby, a desperate, volatile science practiced by those with little else to occupy their privileged but miserable lives. They were not master chemists, nor did they possess precise equipment. They merely possessed rancor, endless boredom, and access to the apothecary's shelves. The art form, therefore, was steeped in utter culinary incompetence. The challenge, naturally, was delivery. How do you make a slow-acting chemical agent indistinguishable from dinner? You don't confront your rival, you seduce them with sweetness. And thus, we turn to the apothecary cabinet and the deadly appeal of simple sugar. Arsenic, in its most crude forms, found its way into the mouths of the elite. It was deceptively simple, a common metallic taint easily disguised by the very culinary staples designed to enhance pleasure. Think of arsenic sugar. This wasn't some dramatic theatrical element. It was simply grit and deadly salt, mixed with crystalline white sweetener, until the danger disappeared behind a veil of sugary oblivion. The concept is profoundly unsettling. Taking an ingredient meant for delight, a dusting of powdered sweetness on a biscuit, a garnish in a cordial, and transforming it into a subtle threat. The intention wasn't instant death. It was slow systemic failure, a creeping wasting that looked, at first, the melancholic hand of poor living or bad digestion. The difficulty lay in consistency and taste. Arsenic has a distinct metallic edge flavor profile that is not conducive to refined aristocratic palate. The amateur toxicologist, be they a heartbroken wife, a scorned cousin, or simply a man slighted over the allocation of prime livestock, had to become an expert mimic. They had to know which spiced wine would mask the off note, or what expensive spice blend could neutralize the bitter tang of mineral death. This culinary conundrum led to desperation recipes that are breathtakingly simple in their cruelty. Sometimes it was a nightshade tincture added discreetly to morning bread pudding. Other times it was an admixture into the wine cooler served during the height of festivities. The process demanded meticulous knowledge, not just of deadly compounds, but of biochemistry and digestion rates. And the sheer carelessness of the perpetrators meant that success was always contingent on multiple failing points. The ingredients were often drawn from readily available sources. Plant toxins sourced from wild woodland walks, mineral poisons bought discreetly from merchants specializing in dyes, or rudimentary medicine. But even within this seemingly perfect arsenal, fatal mistakes awaited. A slight overmeasure of a concentrated extract could result not just in the intended illness, but in acute poisoning that rendered the perpetrator as susceptible to suspicion and arrest. The sheer amateur quality of these attempts adds a dark layer of comedy to the historical tragedy. We find recipes documented through court gossip or fragmented medical texts detailing blends of poppy seeds mixed with bile salts, or even mixtures using highly concentrated animal venoms intended to induce debilitating seizures. These were not precise chemical formulations. They were desperate guesses based on folklore and ill-informed readings of nature's deadliest pharmacy. The risk wasn't limited solely to the victim. Infiltrating a poisoning attempt required chemistry skills, usually reserved for illuminated manuscripts, patience that could last months, and an invisibility that was almost impossible at a lavish medieval feast. The careful balancing act, mixing the toxin into something pleasurable enough to consume without suspicion, but concentrated enough to do lasting damage, was nearly insurmountable. Every single preparation carried the distinct possibility of ruining not just the rival's reputation, but the stomach and digestive system of the person who administered it. It was a game played with mortal stakes, using kitchen implements, sugar bowls, wine goblets, and finely ground spices. The ultimate insight gleaned from these messy historical accounts is that while the lure of poisoning offered an escape from the tedious humiliations of court life, a way to achieve vengeance without incurring the consequences of open confrontation or outright slander, it was overwhelmingly unreliable. The window between a debilitating illness and true, irreversible contamination was shockingly narrow for untrained hands. The sophisticated veneer of noble malice often shattered against the harsh reality of human physical limits, proving that sometimes the easiest escape from a feud was to simply turn away, leaving your poison unsullied and misunderstood. Having established that the simmering tensions of medieval courts were fueled by everything from spilled wine to a perceived slight in the allocation of boar rib, we found ourselves drawn into a dark hobby, the careful art of social sabotage. The ambition here was rarely death itself. Rather, it was the exquisite misery of incapacitation. It was about removing a rival from the immediate fray, not necessarily from life, but from visibility. A subtle dulling of wit, an insidious lethargy that ensured they missed the crucial tournament match or failed to make their intended grand speech. The goal was reputational ruin achieved through biological means. This is where the botanical knowledge became a weapon far more nuanced than mere sweeteners, where arsenic was quick and dirty, often leading only to shared nausea between perpetrator and victim. Nightshade offered something subtler: confusion and creeping fatigue. We are talking about botanicals that could cloud the mind, dull the senses, and undermine concentration. The perfect tools for a rival who relied on sharp wit and dramatic flair to maintain their station. The early modern apothecary shelves were less repositories of healing remedies and more unstable laboratories of desperate intent. Toxins, often harvested directly from wild greenery, were categorized not by effect, but by potential discreetness. Belladonna, hemlock, foxglove, each held a promise of slow, deliberate downfall. However, the difference between an effective incapacitating dose and a reversible systemic failure was maddeningly thin, requiring not just malice, but an almost alchemical precision that few noble schemers possessed. The poisoner in this scenario became less a murderous villain and more a desperate academic, struggling to understand human physiology through deadly plant chemistry. They were forced to navigate the complex relationship between botany, social status, and brute spite. The preparation itself was a ritual of elevated paranoia. A rival might be given a cordial tainted with specific extracts that induced excessive drowsiness, not enough to cause an immediate scandal, but enough to ensure they slept deeply during the crucial court debate or the important harvest festival dance. The chemistry employed here was profoundly amateurish, bound by limited knowledge, and compounded by sheer emotional desperation. The medieval understanding of biology was rooted in humors. A poison needed to disrupt the body's natural equilibrium, to overcool the spirit, perhaps, or to introduce an imbalance that manifested as extreme weariness and confusion. This conceptual framework guided both their successful attempts and their spectacular failures. The greatest risk, naturally, lay in dosage estimation. A pinch of dried foxglove petals might induce a mild sense of detachment, enough to make one appear melancholy and unsuited for governance. But slightly too much, combined perhaps with the natural variations in alcohol content of the serving wine or cordial, could push the dose into fatal arrhythmia. These attempted social sabotage was therefore always a terrifying tightrope walk between nuisance and mortality. It speaks volumes about the paranoid state of high medieval society that such botanical resources were so readily weaponized by the ostensibly cultured. A dinner conversation, meant to be an intellectual flexing of muscles, could become a physiological crisis. The victim might complain not just of headaches or malaise, but of a strange, inexplicable inability to focus, a lethargy that suggested mental weakness rather than political rivalry. This diagnosis was often far more destructive than a sudden death. Yet, even in this relatively safe territory of social dulling, failure loomed large. The delicate alkaloids required perfect preparation and consistent application. An unexpected change in the soil composition, an imprecise measure based on gut feeling rather than scientific measurement, or simply the natural variation in human metabolism, could turn a mild sedative into something far more dramatic. Stories abound of rivals who were supposed to merely appear flushed or overly tired at key social functions, only to collapse altogether, bringing not just their own scandal, but often drawing the suspicion of the entire court onto themselves, or worse, onto the family that provided them with the suspicious cordial. This pattern reveals a chilling truth about the aristocratic life. Every ritual, every shared meal was inherently suspect. The simple act of offering a favored draught or sharing a bowl of spiced pudding became an overt gesture of potential violence. It wasn't just the poison itself. It was the intimate act of consumption, the shared moment, that made poisoning so potently devastating within this specific cultural context. The intellectual pursuit here was not pharmacology, but emotional manipulation, guided by phytochemistry. The goal was to make a man seem fundamentally flawed, unreliable, forgetful, melancholic, without leaving any visible physical trauma that could be traced back to the schemer. It was a poison of reputation, delivered in liquid form and harvested from the dark corners of the earth. This elevated the mere rivalry over who received the last boar rib into a terrifyingly sophisticated game of chemical chess, where the pieces were human minds, and the board was the highly flammable social structure of the court. The desperate life of a courtier was one defined by fragile social graces and crushing jealousy. Every compliment felt like flattery, every silence an accusation, and the perfect meal offered itself as the ultimate stage for revenge. Through chapters, we saw how deeply ingrained the art of poisoning had become. It wasn't reserved for villainous melodrama, but was simply a hobby, a means to settle debts over who got the last boar rib or whose silks were finer. But even in the most carefully plotted scheme, human desperation and sheer incompetence played their inevitable part. If the first attempts at poisoning were defined by clumsy measurements and easily detected sugars, Chapter 3 taught us the delicate art of social sabotage, a precise dose to ruin a reputation without shedding blood. The perfect scheme required patience, high skill, and usually the complicity of another drunkard's cupbearer. It was sophisticated malice wrapped in layers of ceremonial etiquette. But the reality of life at court rarely cooperated with theory. Schemes required witnesses who might talk, recipes that could be replicated by a slightly less skilled servant, and targets who were not immune to accidental consumption. The stakes were always high, ruin or death. And when failure was guaranteed by sheer human error, the result was often a far more chaotic disaster than any perfectly executed plot. This brings us to the messy, unfortunate reality of accident at court. Poisoning required an immense level of attention to detail, the proper timing, the specific blending of herbs, the exact dosage that tipped the balance from incapacitation to fatality. To fail was not simply to lose your rival. It was to invite immediate and highly visible medical catastrophe upon yourself. Imagine the scene. A grand feast nearing its climax. Whispers suggest a particular dish or drink is specially prepared for an opponent. Perhaps the goal is simply to ensure that the target becomes dramatically ill, unable to attend the morning council meeting, thus dissolving his influence. The plan is set in motion. A tincture slipped into a cordial, a powder dusted onto breadcrumbs meant only for one mouth. The powdered nightshade, or perhaps the arsenic sugar from earlier schemes, has been delivered to its intended receptacle. However, medieval life was rarely linear. People stumbled, servants miscounted ingredients, and distracted nobles would accept the poisoned draught not by his rival, but by an errant friend who simply meant well, believing it was a medicinal remedy. This is where the poisoning ritual devolved into utter chaos. The victim did not receive the calculated malice. They received whatever dose had been accidentally mixed in that bowl, a toxic melange designed for one person's stomach, now available to many. The fallout from such an accidental betrayal of trust would be immediate and terrifyingly public. Instead of a subtle decline in fortune or a mysterious vanishing act, the symptoms manifested in vivid, violent ways. Sudden, intense retching, discoloration of the skin that signaled internal failure, tremors that betrayed a failing constitution. The physician's role was desperate guesswork, relying on outdated humoral theory to distinguish between an attack from a rival and a mere case of consumption. The sheer absurdity of these medical misadventures cannot be overstated. In today's understanding, diagnosing the exact toxin in such a chaotic setting is virtually impossible. They would treat the symptoms the burning pain, the violent vomiting, the severe gastrointestinal distress, while little was understood about toxicology itself. The wealthy and powerful were trapped between genuine illness and deliberate chemical warfare, with no medical professionals possessing the forensic rigor we understand today. Sometimes, a poorly measured dose of emetic intended to merely upset a rival's stomach would become lethal due to an unforeseen interaction with another natural substance present in the banquet hall, or perhaps a poison meant for a single cup was accidentally stirred into the massive communal punch bowl used by half a dozen guests. The perpetrator, whether through carelessness or panicked self-preservation, found themselves deeply implicated in the sudden, collective collapse of their peers. Their initial goal, a small victory over one person's ego, had exploded into an immediate, life-threatening spectacle. These moments of accidental poisoning serve as a gruesome indictment of the entire toxic culture at court. They highlight not only the deadly potency of certain botanical poisons, but also the absolute fragility of human social structures. The most dangerous element was rarely the toxin itself. It was the desperate paranoia that led people to assume such chemical weapons were available, and worse, that they could be managed with mere seasoning and a serving spoon. Ultimately, these messy episodes taught one profound lesson about political survival in the medieval world. The more complex your plot, the higher the risk of spectacular failure. A carefully calibrated dose required expertise. An accidental mixing bowl required nothing but chaos. And even when true murder was achieved, and these instances were always bloody and dramatic, the effort, the sourcing, the preparation, and the inherent risk of being discovered often outweighed the simple satisfaction of eliminating a rival's perceived slight. The grand takeaway, sadly, is that amid all the arsenic, the nightshade, and the elaborate preparations for death, sometimes the easiest, safest, and most brutally effective weapon was not a liquid poison. It was merely words, the slanderous whisper that could stain a name irrevocably without ever touching a single stomach. The paranoia was not merely an emotion that struck at the feasting hall. It became a tangible commodity, a sort of social armament. If poisoning through food was difficult enough, requiring perfect timing and impeccable blending, then medieval people began looking everywhere else for a vector. Every object within the palatial confines suddenly carried potential danger. Every gesture held chemical menace. The act of giving a gift transformed from a hopeful exchange into a calculated trap. Consider the perfumes. A vial of exotic oils meant to flatter and entice could be laced with substances that induced paralysis or slow systemic failure. These weren't just status symbols, they were death warrants wrapped in silk ribbons. The subtle scent of musk, now carrying the promise of oblivion. Likewise, the ceremonial beverages, the expensive wines, The potent sherries, exotic cordials remained primary targets, but the poisoners became increasingly creative with their methods. If the drink was too easily monitored, they turned to objects associated with ritual purity and exchange. The textile arts provided another deadly canvas. A highly embroidered handkerchief or a richly scented tapestry could be treated. Certain toxins could be absorbed through contact or slow diffusion from porous materials. One might present a beautiful, finely woven garment as a sign of fealty, knowing that the material itself held the venom. The sheer depth of paranoia meant that even things like specialized soaps used in public bathing or cosmetics intended for ritual use entered the poisoned gift registry. This was not the act of a grand villain planning an epic downfall. This was the frantic machination of someone obsessed with ensuring their rival failed at exactly the right moment. They weren't aiming for spectacle, they were aiming for silence and plausible deniability. The poisoning had to look like misfortune or even devotion. If the victim suddenly fell ill after receiving a specific gift, a new comb, an ornate box, a rare spice, the ensuing inquiry would naturally point towards frailty, bad luck, or divine displeasure, rather than a methodical attack. The sophistication of these delivery systems was remarkable. If desperately over-engineered, it required deep knowledge not only of toxicology, but also of social protocol and the physical properties of material goods. The poisoner had to understand how long a scent lingered, how porous certain fabrics were, or what temperature would best diffuse a caustic agent. This turned the gift exchange into a lethal performance art, a moment meant to signify connection and mutual respect, but which instead harbored deadly intent. The consequence of these efforts was often dramatic failure, leading to public accusations that only served to damage the reputation of the plotters as much as the intended victim. These amateur attempts were too complicated, too visible in their ambition. To poison through a gift required meticulous staging, leaving behind evidence, whether it was an unusual residue on porcelain or a barely perceptible change in the aroma of scented soap. The true master of this art understood that sometimes less effort produced greater devastation. The elaborate poisoned comb risked attracting attention from every court attendant and physician alike. By contrast, a whisper in a darkened corner proved infinitely more potent. The poison administered through carefully cultivated rumor could mimic the slow onset of natural illness, the fevers, the melancholy, the wasting sickness, and leave no trace in either the bloodstream or the mouth. The poisoning gift exchange thus illustrates a point of profound despair, that when status anxiety reaches its zenith, people will engage in activities bordering on mad science. They will try to transform social graces into chemical weapons, replacing courtesy with caustic agents. The most dangerous poison, it turns out, was not arsenic or nightshade, It was the certainty that every single object offered as a sign of affection could and might be contaminated by spite. Throughout the lavish feasts and shadowed court halls, the narrative of violence often focused on things you could see: a poisoned cup, a tainted feast dish. But what if the most devastating weapon required no purchase, no secretive preparation, only breath? The sheer ease of rumor and gossip offered a path to ruin that was far less messy than toxicology, far safer for the perpetrator's own stomach. Consider the effort attempting slow-acting poisoning with nightshade or arsenic sugar demanded careful sourcing, complex timing, and perfect execution. It required chemists' knowledge disguised as culinary skill, a perilous charade performed under the veneer of polite society. Failure meant not just a dead rival, but often accusations of madness, accidental self-poisoning, or at least a catastrophic stomach ailment visible to all. The Slander Gambit, however, was dramatically simple. It required only two things: spite and an audience. The toxin was simply the truth, twisted until it held no recognizable shape, delivered by the insidious medium of the whispered conversation. It did not demand knowledge of apothecaries or a mastery of chemical disguises. Instead, it leveraged the fragility of reputation, a commodity in medieval life that was often more valuable than gold itself. A man's standing rested on his word, his lineage, and the witnesses who could swear to his honor. And those were things remarkably susceptible to exaggeration, omission, or outright fabrication. By contrast, arsenic sugar represented a tangible, physical risk. It left trace evidence, even if rudimentary by modern standards. But reputation, a tarnished whisper, could spread across 100 miles of tapestry-covered hall before the victim had time to gather their wits. Gossip acted as an invisible plague capable of inflicting irreparable damage without leaving a single detectable residue. The aristocrats and petty criminals who dabbled in physical poisoning were brilliant at the art of misdirection. They built elaborate plots involving contaminated combs or sugared wine. But this high degree of effort always carried proportional risk. The longer the scheme, the more points of failure: the bribed servant, the misplaced dose, the overly diligent steward, and thus the higher the chance that the plot would unravel disastrously. Slander operates differently. It is decentralized violence. A rumor does not need a carrier. It needs only an echo chamber. Once planted, the story finds its own footing, mutating and strengthening with each retelling, losing all pretense of verifiable fact. An accusation of illegitimacy could strip a lord of his title before he knew where to look for legal redress. Allegations of heresy could condemn him in the eyes of God and man long before any secular court was assembled. The genius of the Slander Gambit lies in its perfect blend of low effort and devastating consequence. It allowed the desperate noble, unable or unwilling to risk a literal poisoned meal over a lost boar rib, to engage in conflict through social manipulation. The cost was minimal, perhaps just the expense of an overly expensive perfume for the messenger, and the payoff could be total societal destruction. Medieval society provided the perfect breeding ground for this non-physical warfare. Their rigid caste structures, their reliance on oral tradition for history and law, and their constant need to publicly affirm status made them perpetually vulnerable to reputational assaults. To live in a world where everything depended on being seen as honorable was to be constantly under siege by invisible enemies. Therefore, when faced with the choice between sourcing arsenic from an illicit apothecary, or merely speaking malicious truths or lies to one's peers, many found the latter path both easier and more reliable. Poisoning required proximity, precise measurement, and a clean getaway. Slander simply required conviction, malice, and someone enough foolish to listen. It was a subtle shift in weaponry. From the lethal physical science of toxins, we arrived at the devastating social science of pure paranoia. And for the fragile ego of the ambitious courtier, fueled by jealousy over status or romance, pure paranoia proved to be the deadliest element of all, even if the poison itself was potent enough to kill a nobleman in his sleep. The true terror of medieval poisoning lay not just in the deadly element, but in the sheer mystery surrounding its detection. Medieval life possessed an uneasy relationship with science. They had herbal knowledge bordering on mastery, yet lacked any systematic forensic discipline. They could create perfect biological weapons, but their ability to investigate them was almost non-existent. The medieval mind often conflated chemistry and medicine. A remedy intended to cure a gout flare might easily contain compounds capable of causing intense nausea, or even fatal cardiac arrhythmia if misused or misunderstood. The lines between restorative elixir and slow poison were not merely blurred. They often merged entirely in the hands of an amateur apothecary acting on fear and rumor. Understanding what happened after death was fraught with uncertainty. If a nobleman collapsed, the natural assumption was often divine displeasure, poor constitution, or simple moral failing. Direct evidence of toxicological poisoning, a metallic residue, or a distinct alkaloid compound, was exceedingly rare in archaeological records for reasons that remain murky even to modern science. When symptoms appeared, they were generalized. Wasting away, tremors, unexplained gut distress. The body could suffer from dozens of maladies, and the subtle markers of arsenic exposure or nightshade ingestion often mimicked natural decline. The physicians, while sometimes genuine intellectual authorities, operated within a framework that was deeply humoral. Illness was believed to stem from an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Therefore, Any mysterious illness was treated not as a chemical incident, but as a profound constitutional failure, requiring balancing drafts of wine, purgatives, or bloodletting. This reliance on humoral theory meant that even when poisoning did occur, the response was purely medical charlatanism. If suspicion lingered, it was directed at astrology or spiritual malfeasance rather than chemical analysis. They might blame curses cast by envious mages or foul humors drawn from swamp gas, because tracking a specific poison required knowledge far beyond their illuminated texts. The practical consequences of this scientific vacuum were enormous. The murderer faced minimal evidence to overcome. If the victim died after consuming a poisoned pudding, and no clear source, no residue in a bowl, no unusual spice that could be traced back to a known toxic plant was found, the case evaporated into suspicion and conjecture. This created an environment where paranoia could flourish absolutely unchecked. Because death was attributable to divine will or natural imbalance, and not demonstrable chemical interference, the guilty parties walked free with only shattered reputations as their downfall. The killer wasn't prosecuted for poison. They were often merely accused of malice, a much softer charge that carried less weight in the law. The very process of trying to detect poisoning thus became an exercise in futility, despite the profound terror it inspired. It was the perfect crime by definition, a fatal event with no fingerprint, no chemical signature understood enough to prove malicious intent. The suspect could claim accident, and the authorities had no reliable way to distinguish between accidental ingestion during a careless feast or the calculated delivery of death. This lack of forensic certainty contributed hugely to the vicious cycle of courtly life. Knowing that outright physical proof was so unattainable did not curb ambition. It merely changed the scope of violence. If murder required perfect planning and near miraculous execution, then subtle psychological ruin, the whispers, the scandalous reputation, the slow withdrawal of favor became disproportionately appealing. The ultimate takeaway from this scientific failure is darkly ironic. All the intricate knowledge gathered on arsenic, nightshade, and cardiac toxins, all the dedication to crafting complex delivery systems in gift perfumes or elaborate custards, it was all, ultimately, often less effective than a well-timed accusation made before an assembly of gossiping courtiers. The most potent poison was not something that killed the body. It was something that destroyed the social scaffolding upon which nobility depended, honor and reputation. In this medieval landscape, where science failed to deliver conclusive proof, mere gossip held eternal power. It was a safety net built entirely out of human vanity and fear. We have traced the desperate reach of medieval paranoia from petty squabbles over boar ribs to sophisticated plots involving poisoned perfumes. We learned that even when attempting true murder, the average amateur was notoriously inept. Their schemes often failed through sheer clumsiness, turning malicious intent into a chaotic household emergency. If the threat of arsenic sugar was proof of the depth of feudal animosity, then the medical treatments themselves offered a dark mirror to this toxic fixation. For in medieval life, there was almost no clear dividing line between potent cure and fatal poison. The very apothecaries who dealt in venoms were simultaneously celebrated healers, trusted advisors, and unwitting purveyors of death. The prevailing understanding of the human body was rooted in humors, the theory that illness stemmed from an imbalance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. To treat a person, one did not simply remove an infection, one rebalanced a chemical constitution. And what better way to achieve radical internal transformation than through highly concentrated herbal decoctions or mineral preparations? These remedies were powerful, often overwhelming, systems that promised restoration, but frequently delivered acute toxicity. The process was fundamentally high-risk performance art. A physician's intervention meant to revitalize the patient's constitution and expel malignant humors could, by its very nature, be violently destabilizing. The margin for error was microscopic. Too little dosage, and nothing happened; too much, and the patient faced collapse, neurological failure, or internal hemorrhage. This blurring of lines created a terrifying complicity. A rival noble might not merely poison you in secret, they could corruptly persuade your own physician, or worse, sponsor the care that harmed you, convincing you that what was actually debilitating poisoning was, in fact, necessary purging. The struggle for life became intertwined with the authority of medicine itself. It wasn't just about mixing death into a wine. It was about co-opting the highest forms of trusted knowledge to facilitate harm. A rival could manipulate a doctor's diagnosis, claiming that your physical weakness or malaise was not due to foul play, but merely an overabundance of corrupt bile, a condition requiring aggressive and highly toxic intervention. Consider the medicinal misadventure. A patient suffers from what we now know is chronic poisoning, perhaps subtle arsenic ingestion. The physician observes pallor, digestive upset, and persistent weakness. Lacking modern toxicology, he deduces humoral imbalance, prescribing complex regimens involving purges, heavy metals, or extremely potent laxatives, all substances that interact dangerously with the poison already in the system. His cure becomes a catastrophic accelerant. The history of medicine from this era is littered with examples where brilliant scientific ignorance led directly to lethal outcomes. These treatments were often dramatic and public performances, bloodlettings accompanied by highly toxic herbal poultices, or complex mineral concoctions meant to fortify the spirit. The outcome was rarely predictable. Survival hinged entirely on chance, and whether the patient's body could withstand an onslaught of chemically aggressive, powerful substances. This dynamic provided another exquisite delivery vector for social ruin. To poison someone directly required access to their supper or their unguent vase. But having a trusted medical relationship offered a subtly more insidious means. Weaponizing care itself, a rival did not need to physically force the poison draft. They only needed to inject subtle discord into the patient's life, sowing doubt among friends about their physician's intentions, or, perhaps even better, funding enough of the cure that it inevitably went too far. The irony is profound. The greatest source of perceived danger in the medieval court was not always the desperate cup handed by a jealous hand, but sometimes the very object meant to sustain life, a diagnosis misread, an herbal remedy overly potent, or a fever treated with alarming doses of mercury. These were all forms of unintended poisonings that flourished under the banner of genuine care. We see a consistent pattern emerge, whether through culinary contamination, poisoned gifts, or corrupted medical treatment. The core weaponization strategy was low-tech in concept, but devastatingly effective. It required exploiting trust and manipulating deep cultural beliefs, beliefs in humors, belief in aristocratic superiority, belief in divine intervention through highly complex and often misunderstood rituals. The medieval elite were masters of believing they knew better than nature. They believed their social rank afforded them access to the secrets of preservation, but these same overweening confidence and desperate ingenuity meant that the line between salvation and destruction was not merely faint, but utterly non-existent. For in a world where the body's systems were understood through mystical balance rather than empirical chemistry, every cure carried the twin risk of accidental death, making both the poisoner and the healer equally dangerous figures on the grand stage of human paranoia. After the whispered exchange of poison trinkets and the dangerous mingling of dubious elixirs with restorative medicine, one must ask a deeply unsettling question. Did all this escalating malice come from genuine fear? Or was it sometimes just sport? As our investigation into medieval toxicity reveals, for many nobles, plotting slow revenge became less about desperation and more about lifestyle. The venomous whisper, the perfect dose of botanical ruin, these acts were often performative, a bizarre signal of status within their rigid social structures. When honor was fragile and life felt disposable among the gilded cage of court, poisoning transitioned from an act of survival into a decadent hobby. After the lavish displays of poisoning, the sugar-laced betrayals, the Nightshade whispers, and the accidental gastronomic disasters, one must ask a question. What was the true cost of such meticulously planned malice? The effort involved in procuring poisons, mastering dosage, and executing the perfect delivery system was staggering. It demanded not only specialized knowledge, but an absolute commitment to death or debilitating sickness. A feud carried out by chemical means was rarely merely about status. It was a life-altering, all-consuming obsession that threatened the very foundation of noble reputation and familial stability. And yet, history suggests these grand machinations were exhausting, messy, and often spectacularly ineffective at achieving true, lasting victory. We saw attempts ruined by poor measurement, medical disasters stemming from overconfidence, or simply blown apart by a single suspicious servant. What was left when the physical evidence, the telltale traces of arsenic or foxglove, was either too subtle to detect or rendered inconclusive? The solution, ironically, often lay in abandoning science entirely